Welcome everybody, I am 6am Comics, and this is of course, reviewing my 9-year-old's comics. We've reviewed a lot of books from my son Nolan, over 30 of them, and there's still many more to look at. However, while this series mainly focuses on the work of Nolan, there are two other creators living under my roof who occasionally get a mention from time to time. Nolan's little brother Levi, co-creator of Mark Man, and Nolan's older brother and former editor Milo, the other co-creator behind Mark Man. It's practically a running gag at this point that anytime Milo's name is mentioned in association with one of Nolan's books, he is inevitably fired from the project before its completion. Well, this week we've got an anomaly. A two-part series known simply as Super Nolan and Super Milo Stickman Stories, illustrated by Nolan and written by Milo. This week we'll be taking a look at part 1. So let's do that. Now, before I get started, let's just first establish that despite the name, this Super Nolan has zero association with Worldwide Comics' flagship character, Super Nolan. This is simply a stick figure representation of Nolan himself, who also happens to be able to fly and shoot lasers out of his eyes. But it's not the same guy. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin our analysis by taking a look at the overall presentation. While Nolan is the lead illustrator on this book, you can immediately see Milo's influence on the title via the use of stick figures, something Milo has achieved success with via his own flagship character, Marker Man. However, Nolan's creative input will simply not allow this book's art style to be basic stick figures, and he gives these characters a little more flair and some subtle distinctions in the faces of our two protagonist brothers. Given the length of this book, a grand total of 2 interior pages and 1 cover, Nolan was able to commit greater resources to giving this book the full color treatment. Between the coloring and the highly detailed stick figure art style, this remains one of the most visually distinct entries in the entire household. Notice how I'm avoiding labeling this as a Worldwide Comics, or to a lesser extent, a Nolan Club Comics production. This is because Nolan has strictly forbidden this series to be included in the Worldwide Archive. As you no doubt have already guessed, this series didn't last long, given the nature of this particular sibling rivalry, and although it has 2 entries, a third entry which would have concluded the story was never created. Now that we've discussed the visuals, I'd like to point out that although Milo is listed as the author, he's not listed as the editor. While Nolan and Milo did temporarily come to peaceful terms to get this book created, Nolan still maintained that Milo's termination as editor was permanent and refused to undo his firing. This is why, despite Milo's writing credits, we yet again find a comic riddled with typos and inconsistent punctuation. So being that we can't review Milo's editing skills, let's take a look at his writing skills and go over the story. Wasting no time on meaningless settings, we begin with a brief explanation of Milo and Nolan's powers. They're not called super for nothing, after all. Nolan has laser eyes. We're not only told this, we're given a comical example of said laser eyes as Nolan incinerates a pizza that Milo was preparing to eat. Nolan does this while levitating in the air, establishing that he not only can shoot lasers from his eyes, but fly too, although we never see this power put to use again. And Milo could form things, even in his sleep. So essentially, Nolan shoots lasers, Milo has some magical manifestation ability in which he can create anything from thin air. A fun power, except that it can be triggered while he's unconscious, which we'll see proves to be a dangerous drawback to his power. As Milo is asleep that evening, energy is released from his hand. The next day, Milo walks down the stairs to a groggy Nolan, who is still half asleep. As Nolan falls back asleep on the floor, Milo is alerted to something happening upstairs in his bedroom. Back in his room, Milo is, I want to say shocked? Is that a shocked look? To see what has occurred. A portal seemingly created in his sleep has been growing in his bedroom. He drags Nolan into the room telekinetically. I guess that's also something he can do, waking him up. Hey, I'm trying to sleep here. This is what I look like in the morning. That's pretty accurate. As the portal grows, it begins to pull the superpowered brothers in. Good grief! Brace yourself! The to be continued is inferred, as it isn't actually written anywhere, A bold choice for a cliffhanger. So what can be said about this introductory issue? While short, it does well establishing our two protagonist brothers. It wastes no time familiarizing us with their powers and personalities, and it gives an interesting enough premise to invest in. Just what does exist on the other end of that portal? How will these two siblings work together to survive the potential trials that await on the other side? Will they work together at all, or be driven apart? Speaking of the relationship between these siblings, let's take a moment and analyze their powers. Nolan, much like his Worldwide Comics counterpart, has laser eyes and flight, although his ability to fly is never seen beyond panel 2, not even in the follow-up issue. Milo has the ability to manifest objects out of thin air and move items telekinetically. However, much like Nolan's flight, the telekinesis makes no further appearances past this issue as well. What I find interesting is how, of the two real-life brothers, Nolan has always showed himself to be more of a creative force, while Milo has always been more of a technical force. And yet in this comic, it's Milo whose power is fueled by his own imagination. You could say this entire comic is a statement. As writer, Milo is now assuming the role of creative, while Nolan's role is simply to follow orders, i.e., draw what Milo writes. You almost could relate this to Nolan's power in the book itself, laser eyes, i.e., aim and fire. It's as though Milo is pointing a creative gun at a blank canvas, and when he pulls the trigger, Nolan's art fires at the page. Seem far-fetched? What's Nolan's character doing for the majority of the book? He's sleeping. He's creatively comatose. Heck, we see early on that Nolan at one point had the ability to fly. Flight is often associated with freedom. And yet following that panel, his ability to fly is gone. Not only does he never fly again, he's also moved around telekinetically like a puppet as he struggles to remain conscious. In fact, let's think about consciousness for a moment. The story begins with Milo sleeping. While he sleeps, something awakens. His creative powers open a portal. Following this event, the two brothers switch roles, with Milo being wide awake and in control, and Nolan struggling to stay awake. It makes you wonder what it was Milo was dreaming about that sparked the portal in the first place. Perhaps it has something to do with Nolan zapping Milo's pizza. He did so while flying. He did so while free. And in response, Milo began opening portals, and Nolan never flew again. For just 2 pages, Super Nolan and Super Milo Stickman Stories has easily become the most psychologically complex story that we've ever reviewed on this channel. I'm very curious to see where issue 2 brings us. Will it continue with the meta storytelling, or delve into something more simple and adventure focused? I suppose we'll all know soon enough. And there you have it. The very first successful collaboration between Milo and Nolan. Honestly, this comic belongs in a museum, preserved and studied by comic book analysts for generations to come. But until then, it will have to remain preserved in a pile of other comics drawn by my children, stashed neatly away in my closet. It should be fine. In any case, next time we will take a look at the second and final issue of Super Nolan and Super Milo Stickman Stories. So be sure to check in next Monday for that. As for my rating, I'm gonna give it 2 stars. One for each page. It's so short. It's such a short book.